It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Nigeria's capital, Abuja, Philip Obaji, correspondent for The Daily Beast. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
With us as well, freelance reporter Anne Nivat. How are things?
Great.
Great. Are they great?
Happy to be here.
Okay. Are they great for George Kazolius?
They're okay.
They're okay. George, who blogs at Kazolius.com. And how are things in sunny London? Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report.
Sunny London is a bit of an exaggeration, François, but it's not snowing. So, we thank the Lord for small mercies.
All right. You can, thank you as well for being with us. You can subscribe to the podcast version, by the way, of The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Music, and other fine streaming services. A lot has happened since last week when Belarus's strongman was hinting at cutting the gas to Europe. Migrant camps at the border with Poland have been dismantled. The first charter flight of Iraqis has returned from Minsk. Now, Warsaw, though, is still accusing Belarus of weaponizing would-be asylum seekers, saying this Friday that they'd trucked hundreds back to the border. All week, though, the sounds out of Minsk have been more conciliatory, shall we say.
We came to an agreement that escalation is not in the interests of either the European Union or Belarus. We cannot allow an escalation to happen, even though some may wish for it to happen, all the way up to a direct military confrontation.
So, Anivat,
what a good actor.
Yeah, but this was good Lukashenko.
Well, he's playing gentleman.
Last week we had bad Lukashenko. So what's happened?
Well, he's playing the gentleman, the guy who is now have been overwhelmed with the crisis. But I think what he cannot hide is the joy he has had in making us panic, because that's Europe. That's exactly what he wanted. I wouldn't say that Lukashenko is someone easy to deal with. He's not. I disagree with people who think that Vladimir Putin is able to control him fully. He's not. Putin is not able to fully control Lukashenko. But Lukashenko is at the center of the attention, and that's for him the most important. The most important is to make us realize that he is still the boss. So he thinks.
Is it working?
Because his population disagrees with that.
Right, but is it working in relation to the EU?
In relation with the EU is playing a game of sanctions. I mean, the diplomacy in general, world diplomacy, European diplomacy, is a diplomacy of sanctions. So Lukashenko clearly knows that he is under new sanctions. Sanctions are coming next week, and it's not going to be easy. But on the other hand, more sanctions means for him more leverage, because more room for discussion. So it means he still does exist.
Well, he's already scored a big victory. I mean, the EU is talking to him now. They refused to talk to him. They went through Putin. Now they're talking directly with him. So he scored a big victory. He was playing chicken with Europe. I think he was surprised by the reactions at the border. Europe, obviously, especially Poland, do not want to see a remake of 2015. It isn't going to happen. And so, he figures he's marked some points. He's made those points. The gas was a pretty strong threat.
Yeah, but Putin disagreed with that.
Oh yeah, yes,
immediately.
Yeah, in Europe now that Nord Stream 2 is open, there are other avenues. But I think he's coming out of this sort of like a winner.
Philip Obaji, what have been the reactions where you are to seeing this so-called weaponization of migrants, saying, sure, come along, there are cheap flights, we'll give you a tourist visa, come to Belarus and go straight to the border, please?
Well, it's crazy to start with. And, Nigeria is one country where we have so many people, willing to live for the West. But again, in as much as, migration is something that we're so used to seeing, here in Africa, it's still shocking, seeing migrants, with weapons heading towards the Polish border, and hearing that the Belarusian government in particular, President Lukashenko is behind most of these atrocities we're seeing at the border. So it's shocking to many people. It's not what we thought we will see coming out of Europe, but bizarre scenes and really inhuman treatment to some migrants at the border.
And we saw that first charter flight, and in that first charter flight's back to Iraq, and it's a big defeat for those who do make the trip back. After all, some of our correspondent was telling us, Philip, sold their houses to be able to finance the trip.
Well, it's not something that is surprising to many of us right here. Here in Nigeria, for example, a lot of migrants who try to get to Europe through the Sahara Desert and also through the Mediterranean Sea, have done similar things. But again, it goes to tell you the desperation of a lot of people from third world countries, so to speak, really, really so eager, so desperate to get into Europe. And we may be seeing another migrant crisis as what we saw in 2015. Who knows?
Right. For now, it's calming down a little bit as of this Friday. But at the same time, we're feeling the pressure rise further along. On Thursday, Vladimir Putin warning Russia would, quote, react appropriately to what he described as provocative activity by the West in neighboring Ukraine. This just days after NATO sounded the alarm over Moscow's troop buildup. The Kremlin visibly rattled, it seems, with Putin lashing out at Europe earlier in the week over last month's use by Ukraine of Turkish-made drones against Russian-backed separatists.
Europe had an unintelligible response to this, and the U.S. even supported it. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials say outright that they deployed it and will continue to do so in the future. At the same time, they've organized unscheduled military exercises in the Black Sea. It's as if they don't want us to let down our guard. We'll let them know that we aren't letting our guard down.
So, Patrick Smith, it's volatile with Belarus, it's volatile with Ukraine.
I think there's a very clear connection between the two things because, sure, Lukashenko's tactical goals with this migrant crisis was to get revenge on Poland for supporting the opposition, which most people believe won the last elections in Belarus. So he got revenge on Poland for that. But his strategic aims were to help Putin destabilize the eastern border of the European Union. And also, as he edges closer to Putin, the part of this alliance to test and prod NATO. And I think that fits in very, very closely with Putin's agenda when it comes to Ukraine. And rather than an outright march to the west from Russia, what you're seeing is various prods and pokes at NATO's eastern flank. And I think that's very much what's happening in Ukraine. So it's a kind of game of chicken, if you like. I think both sides, with America having said earlier in this month, saying that Putin is gambling if he's going to move more troops to the Ukrainian border, and then Putin pushing back and blaming not the Americans for ramping up the tension, but actually the European Union, because he had that meeting with Biden in June and still hopes to get a bit of a boost out of that, I think.
So, Nivat, is this making mischief, as they called it in Soviet times? You prod a little bit, you create confusion, or are we headed towards something more serious?
Well, I, for my part, I don't think the two situations are connected. I think it's because of what has been happening on the border between Belarus and Poland that we are starting to talk again about Ukraine. But we could have talked about Ukraine and what has been happening in Ukraine earlier. It's just that it was off the radars of the media, the radars of the media, of the Western media. Because this conflict that we're talking about in Donbass has been going on for 7 years. It's a frozen conflict. It's something that
is it frozen now that there are drones, though?
Well, on both parts, I mean, it's a complete dead end because Russians keep saying the same thing, and they don't want to change their opinion. And it's the same regarding the Ukrainians. I mean, there is a protocol called the Minsk Protocol, signed in 2015, and that is supposed to regulate what's happening in Donbass. But it is not. There is a violation there has been violations of the ceasefire for a long time. There is nothing new in that. The only sort of new thing is the fact that we have more than 100, supposedly 110,000 soldiers on the border. But that is just, for me, I think, for Putin to show off. I mean, we should be used to that. Putin wants us to believe that nobody is going to dictate him what he should do or not do, because I'm not sure that he wants to invade, but he wants us to talk about him for sure. The same way that we are talking about Lukashenko. That would be the connection, actually.
All right, and indeed we are. Just turning our attentions elsewhere, it's not often that Narendra Modi backs down. India's Prime Minister announcing this Friday the repeal of farm laws that have sparked more than a year of protests. This ahead of regional elections in the coming months in key states that have been at the heart of the movement, like Uttar Pradesh and Punjab. Were you surprised, Patrick Smith, when you woke up to this news?
I was a bit, actually, because it's clearly a matter of political desperation on Modi's part and the part of the ruling BJP. But we were having this discussion a year ago about these reforms, and this incredible national movement of farmers against the corporatization of agriculture and Modi's attempts to liberalize the rules, end the state-backed commodity prices and so forth. And it's a real defeat. And Modi has, of course, styled himself as the guy who just doesn't back down. I'm the populist who doesn't brook dissent. So I think it is a major reversal for Modi. And the other question is whether it will actually work. Because you mentioned the coming elections in Uttar Pradesh and the Punjab, and a lot of the farmers there today are saying, well, yeah, Modi has just stopped doing what we told him to stop doing. That doesn't mean we're going to vote for him. 600 farmers have died at the minimum in these protests. People have undergone terrible hardship, separated from their families, running short of food and medicines to make these protests. So I think it's a big victory for people power, and I don't know whether cancelling the reforms at this stage is actually going to help Modi very much in these elections.
George Kazolis?
Well, there are two things about this. The one is that the reforms that he wanted to impose remind me so much of those economic restructuration programs the IMF was imposing in the late 70s, early 80s, and they never worked. They never worked. And in this
case, deregulation and privatization.
You know, the idea that the West wants open access to the markets and free trade and everything like that. Of course, Europe can't complain because look at the European agricultural budget, the subsidies for European agriculture.
But here the charge by the farmers is more that it was Modi's pals that stood to benefit.
Well, I think Modi still has some wiggle room before the elections. You know, he can stir up more nationalist sentiment, more religious sentiment, and maybe even, you know, I don't know, put the Muslims out there as a threat once again to try to get people to vote for him again.
Yeah. The political cloud of farmers was already in the spotlight this week in India, but for other reasons. Seasonal smog, worse than ever in northern India. Part of the blame is on winter weather. Part of it is also on a number of factors, including annual crop stubble burning. Environmentalists complain that rules to phase out stubble burning in the fields are not enforced. There's plenty of blame to go around over that killer smog that's forced the closure of schools and coal plants. And we do mean killer smog.
The number of patients that we are getting now because of respiratory infections, both in the OPD or in the emergency, there has been a 3 to 4-fold rise. This is directly linked to the high levels of pollution.
And Nivad, if you're ever in Delhi at this time of year, you really feel it, that smog. And there's a whiff of irony, pardon the pun, because we're just coming off the COP26 summit, where India helped water down that legislation on phasing out of coal. And here we have this problem, which is both a domestic and an international problem here.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to analyze in details what it means. But what strikes me is that on the one hand, we just talk about it. Modi is quite fragile because it's something to be apologizing in front of its own population as it just did. I mean, it's rare. I've never heard any political leader in Western Europe apologizing. And on the other hand, during the COP26, this coal discussion is still something that is difficult to understand. We still have a lot of problems to understand each other between those who decided and those for whom it's easier to avoid coal, and those like India, for which it's not easy. I mean, they still have to rely on coal. Coal is almost everything they have, especially for electricity. And that is something we have to take into account, because for developing country, coal is still a key reference, a key fuel. So they are torn. The country is torn.
It's a difficult one. And Philip Obaji, I mean, I know where you are in Nigeria, there's also burning of the fields after the plowing, and also for home cooking. How do you tell people to stop using firewood and coal to cook your food? And it's a tough one.
Really very tough, very tough. We have millions of Nigerians who are still living under the poverty line. So people can't afford, gas. People can't afford kerosene. So we have, almost about 100 million Nigerians, under that line. It's really, really going to be tough. And I'm not even sure that the leaders here in Nigeria are really thinking so much about trying to create a reverse or trying to make a step above what we have right now. So in developing countries, the talk of greenhouse gases, talk of transition, it's an issue because we have so many people struggling to even find food to eat. That's not a concern for too many people.
Patrick Smith, we're paying more attention to this. Again, it's seasonal, the smog. We're paying more attention to it, well, because we're coming out of COP26.
Well, right. The great grammatical achievement of India and China was to get the phasing out of coal reworded to the phasing down of coal. Of course, this is a nonsense. We all know that coal is the major contributor to greenhouse gases, and we all know that the West, as well as India and China and South Africa, are complicit in that. And we need to get serious about phasing it out as fast as possible. Unfortunately, the West is not taking the required lead on that, which would be in a country like Nigeria. Philip talked about poverty, but fine. We have the technology, solar cooking. If a Western government, companies, whatever, get together and provide 210 million solar cooking sets of equipment, end of story. People will not need to burn firewood. The technology is there. We need the financial innovation and the forward thinking of the countries with the resources that have created most of the greenhouse gases historically to confess what they've done and to take responsibility. I think that's the way to go.
All right, let's take a look at what's going. Philip Obaji.
Yeah, I totally agree. This requires a synergy of the rich countries, the Western countries, because like he said, they have been the ones who have really depleted our planets much more than, those of us who are now being told to make that transition. So it's not something that the developing world can achieve on its own. It's something that requires, the billionaires, something that requires the richer countries coming together to see how they can make, proper use of cooking fuels available to places like Africa.
Yeah, so it's all about the money. It was the week Sudan experienced its deadliest day of violence since last month's coup. At least 15 killed as pro-junta forces used live ammunition for the second time since Saturday to quell protests, as civilian leaders remain either in prison or under house arrest, like former transitional Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok. Now, despite internet cuts and the crackdown, many Sudanese insist they're determined to fight for their stolen revolution.
الليلة نصرة للثورة ولإعادة المدنية لأن هذا انقلاب كامل الدسم.
العسكر عليهم مسألة الأمن وفقط إدارة الدولة للمدنيين وده عالميا معروف الكلام ده.
George Kazolis, was it a turning point this week?
I don't know. I think the turning point was last December when the civilian government told the military members of the government that they had to get rid of the 255 civilian companies and businesses that they own and run and profit from in total opacity. And the first one was taken from them in May. And I think that's what's going on here is that the military is saying, no, we're not going to give up all our economic interests. We're going to keep this. A lot like what happened in Egypt when Mohamed Morsi went after against what he called the corruption and the businesses that the military brass owned in Egypt. Well, this is, I think, what we're seeing here. And so it was decided in May when the first company was taken away from the military that the brass, they were not going to go along with this.
Is that how you read it, Patrick Smith?
Well, I think it's certainly, I mean, George is certainly right about the economic business interests of the military, the so-called military-industrial state in Sudan. But I think the connected issue is also responsibility for the atrocities committed by the military under Omar al-Bashir's regime, Islamist regime, over the 30 years before he was kicked out of power in April 2019. So, I mean, the Hamdok government, the Hamdok civilian wing of the government, was trying to institute investigations, a proper judicial process, reforming the judicial system, and so on, to hold many senior members of the military and intelligence services to account for those abuses. So I think that's the other wing of the reforms and the transition that Burhan and Hemeti, his number two, wanted to scupper. I don't think they're going to be successful myself in the longer run. And I think it's worth remembering that the reason why there were these demonstrations on Wednesday was that Wednesday was the day that Burhan was meant to step down to be replaced by a civilian head of the transitional authority. So people have got this very much in mind. And those people who went out and fought for the revolution in April 2019, I don't think they're going to give it up that easily. Civil disobedience, they're going to define the military in all sorts of ways, decentralized campaigns across the country. So I think, and they've also, as was said, they've learned their lesson from what happened in Egypt. And I think they're going to be much tougher to budge and overwhelm than the Egyptian opposition proved when El-Sisi took power there.
All right, so and don't expect either side to blink. One final question on this, and I'll put it to you, Nivad. It's a tough one. It's kind of the Faustian pact question, which is, what do you do with the military if they have blood on their hands for the genocide in Darfur, for past atrocities? Do you make a Faustian pact where you say, okay, we'll amnesty you, but you go quietly, or not? Or do you demand justice? How do you do it?
I think the military has no answer. I think the military is not listening to the people. And the international community is also not listening to the people. The people are always the ultimate victims. And military will try to remain on power. Antony Blinken is in the region trying to push up democratic values. But it's sort of easy when you are in front of countries that are so different from your own values. So I wouldn't advise anything regarding Africa.
And regarding in particular Sudan, let's talk about Antony Blinken's visit in Kenya. He mentioned obviously the situation in neighboring Sudan. He had an envoy there when he arrived. He also talked about pressure to stop the spiraling civil war in Ethiopia. And before traveling on to Senegal, the U.S. Secretary of State this Friday in Nigeria, where he talked up military assistance to the government in its fight against jihadists and armed bandits. However, there are strings attached.
Not everything can be solved with more or better equipped armed forces. And attempts to address violent extremism have at times had the perverse effect of violating people's rights, contributing to grievances, and furthering cycles of violence. We urge governments to contribute to and commit to criminal justice and security sector approaches that respect rights, as well as greater accountability for abuses, which is critical for earning the public's trust.
Phil Pobaji, your reaction to what you just heard?
I think what the Americans are doing will, sort of give another excuse to the Nigerian government as to why it's unable to defeat extremists and bandits that are remaining about freely in the northern part of the country. If you go back to many years back in 2012, 2013, when former President Goodluck Jonathan was in power, one reason he gave for his government's inability to defeat Boko Haram in the northeast of the region was the fact that the Americans refused to sell weapons to Nigeria. And when the government went to Russia to buy from the black market, Nigeria began to see some improvements in terms of the security situation in the northeast. So people said, well, his government said it was because we got weapons from the black market. So there's also the argument that these bandits and these criminal elements are causing lots of havoc and maiming and attacking communities, killing people. So the amount of human rights abuses perpetrated by the Nigerian forces, should be overlooked when it comes to the fact that more and more people are being killed. Attacks in communities is increasing in the northern part of the country. But we do understand that the Biden administration is towing the line of the Obama administration in terms of looking at the human rights records of the Nigerian forces before letting them have such level of sophisticated weapons. But I know that the Nigerian government will find an excuse as to why it's unable to defeat these criminal elements, and the Americans will be the ones.
Hold on. So what you're saying effectively is that if they don't get the money, if the U.S. holds their feet to the fire over most notably prosecuting those responsible for extrajudicial killings, for instance, last year's bloody crackdown on the anti-SARS protests, that they'll be able to say, hey, it's because the Americans didn't give us weapons?
Well, I don't expect the Nigerian government to do anything much or anything at all when it comes to prosecuting those who have violated, the rights of civilians, those in the military who have done so. But, we have our way. The Nigerian government has this way of always pointing fingers. So no one will look at the fact that, well, we did not do anything about dealing with human rights abuses. It will be the fact that the Americans just simply refused to sell weapons to Nigeria. Again, also, the Nigerian government have always insisted that they have been quietly dealing with officers that went over the board. But, the Americans in their thinking have still not been willing to work closely with the Nigerian security forces. It's just an excuse that the government will get, or that the Americans are giving to the Nigerians by not selling weapons. It's just an excuse to say, well, you're not giving us weapons, and so we cannot defeat these criminal elements.
When we try to think more broadly about the relationship between America and Africa, remember what Donald Trump used to say about certain African nations. He used to call them shitholes, and he never went to Africa. So Antony Blinken the Biden administration is at least trying to sort of be present and probably trying to compete with the Chinese influence in the region. But that's not easy, and democratic governance is not something that China is caring for. So, and America is caring for those values. So it's not going to be easy. And I'm not sure that Africans really are happy with the way usually their countries are being seen outside of Africa. What is usually stressed is always the crisis in Africa. Genocide, HIV, wars, etc., etc. Never the rest.
Well,
never the rest.
Let me put this to Patrick Smith, because we heard Antony Blinken in his speech this Friday. First of all, he said you don't have to choose between America and China. And the other element is you always wonder now, with the African diasporas and the Nigerian diaspora in the United States is growing, it's getting stronger politically. Is he going to Nigeria for foreign or domestic reasons?
I think it's a combination. And just to reiterate what was said about the way we Western journalists often view Africa, it's worth remembering that the top 3 literary prizes this year were all won by Africans. Ghana won the Nobel Prize, Sarr won the Prix Goncourt, and Galgut won the Booker. Add that to Nigerian movies all over the world now, cult following across Asia, South African music in American nightclubs. You've got a very, very different picture with the burgeoning African diaspora. So there's a long-winded way of answering your question, Francois. I think Blinken and Biden understand that the growing African diaspora in the United States, I think 2 million Nigerians at least in the United States, many of them registered voters, and of course many of them Democratic Party supporters. And ditto, you're beginning to see that right across Europe. You've got African mayors in Italy, Germany, Finland, of all places. So, it's changing. This demographic change is coming. And I think what Blinken is showing some perspicacity here. He's saying, we want to reach out to this generation, a new generation, and try and sort of form some kind of far-sighted alliance. So I think that is one of the most positive things I've heard on this trip.
And George Kazolis, about those strings attached to providing new weaponry?
I remember a few years ago an American study which showed that 90% of the aid they gave the Nigerian military never reached the soldiers. So there's this big question of the corruption of the Nigerian military. The Americans have learned their lesson about giving aid and seeing it disappear. But Nigeria is an essential partner for the war against Islamic terrorism, and the Americans need Nigeria since we stupidly destroyed Libya. We have destabilized all the way down to Cameroon and Chad, and so we have American soldiers in the Central African Republic and in Uganda, etc., trying to help the African soldiers regain control of these insurrections. And Blinken is trying to figure that out. At the same time, the United States just lost a major ally in Ethiopia. I mean, what's going on in Ethiopia is a disaster for the United States. Ethiopia invaded Somalia twice at the behest of the United States to fight the Shabab. It's just a disaster. And it's a powder keg because Egypt has threatened to blow up the Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile. So Blinken is really, I think he's overwhelmed by the problems he has to deal with.
Just one final question on this for you, Philip Obachi. Do you get the sense during this visit that Antony Blinken understands Nigeria?
Well, I just think that, Antony Blinken is more or less continuing with the policy of the Obama administration. And I'm not exactly so sure if they do understand what's going on right here. I'm of the opinion that we're facing a much more difficult issue, which is as much as the issue of human rights violation is very important, but Nigerian government needs to really defeat these criminal elements. Yes, there can be other ways to sanction the Nigerian government or the Nigerian military as to, in terms of how they engage with civilians and in terms of the atrocities they commit. But in terms of, saying that we're not going to sell weapons to you, to fight these bandits, these criminal elements, because your military has committed human rights atrocities, I don't think it makes that much sense.
Yeah, the insurgency, be it jihadists or armed bandit groups.
Yeah, but one thing is to understand, but another one is to act. Will the Biden administration overturn the decision, Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. soldiers in Somalia? I mean, that is the key question for the future of the region too.
We'll just ask one question before we go, which is, where is Peng Shuai, the Chinese tennis star, out of the public eye since she accused in a quickly deleted social media post a former vice premier, Zhang Gaoli, of forcing her to have sex? If Chinese public broadcaster CGTN wanted to reassure world public opinion with a tweet purportedly from Peng, well, that has backfired miserably. The screenshot of an alleged email that effectively says, "I'm fine, but need some private time," has instead raised alarm throughout the planet, particularly in the tennis world.
Honestly, it's shocking, that she's missing. I mean, more so that it's someone that I've seen on the tour in the previous years quite a few times. So, I mean, there's not much more to say than hope that she'll be found, that that she's okay, and it's terrible that I can imagine just how her family feels.
George Kazolis, know where Peng Shuai is.
Why is this a story? I don't understand it. I mean, tens of thousands of Ethiopian women have been raped and even murdered this past year in the war. We're not talking about that. 12-year-old girls in Afghanistan are being sold by their parents.
Okay, I'll argue. I'll
tell you why.
I'll argue the.
This woman chose, but this woman chose to go to bed with this guy. She had other choices. She could have quit
the details
tennis.
remains to be analyzed, but I think it's a story because, and that's what is interesting actually, is because she is a powerful and independent Chinese woman, and things like that can even happen to women like her.
And taking on a more powerful Chinese man in this case.
In a country where the hashtag #MeToo is very difficult to develop. So I think that's why it's a story.
I think it's the season to bash China, and we got a rich and beautiful person who's being repressed, and we're ignoring people who are really suffering. She had a choice. She could have quit tennis and sold fish in Wuhan, or she could have.
She could have keep playing tennis.
She wanted to be famous
and
be
independent and powerful.
She was an adult. She made the choice to go to bed with this guy because she wanted to remain powerful.
We're not really sure.
We don't know the details on that, and we don't know the specifics. Patrick Smith, I want to ask you, without second-guessing what happened in private, just that tweet, how it backfired so miserably. What does that tell you about China?
It tells you, for all the efforts that the Beijing government has put into controlling social media and developing artificial intelligence surveillance systems and all the rest of it, mishandling and miscalculating on social media can still backfire. And let's face it, tens of millions of people around the world, and many of them in China, are using VPNs and getting this information, seeing it for themselves, and making their own decisions. I don't think this is it's beyond what can be said by governments for and against China. This is, these are the Chinese citizens who are going to make their own minds up about this, and the rest of the world, and good for them. Let them do it. And I think just because terrible things are happening in Ethiopia and Sudan as we speak, we can condemn that in the strongest possible terms, but we can also condemn any sexual violation at any level, whether it's a celebrity in Hollywood or China or it's a woman in Tigray region. It's the same damn thing, and I think we need to crack down on it and be vocal about it.
All right, and we'll leave with that. Unfortunately, we're running short on time. I want to thank you so much, Patrick Smith, for being with us from London, Filippo Bacci in Abuja, and Nivat, George Kazolis. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.